Thank you very much, Unni, for those kind words. I'm going to... it's a bit difficult to adjust swiftly to a talk which, as it were, has already placed me. So I'm just going to place myself in the way that I plan to anyway. And I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that not having coordinated, I'm not quite sure how to do anything other than do what I was going to do anyway. But thank you for the kind words. So we've been discussing the challenges of the integration of immigrants in Europe mostly, and I'm not an expert on that. I was born in London, and I wasn't an immigrant. So I thought the most useful thing for me to do would be to place the idea of multiculturalism in a sort of philosophical context. I think the main contribution of philosophy to public life is to provide people with richer conceptual tools for thinking about public questions. And so here are just some philosophers' notes on multiculturalism. So multiculturalism, I think, is a collection of responses in the advanced democracies to the recognition of the diversity of their ethno-racial and religious identities. And in what follows when I say identity, I'll mean ethno-religious identity. Obviously, we have gender identities and other identities as well, but for the moment, I'm going to focus on those. And as the name suggests, multiculturalism tends to assume that identities are associated with differences in culture, meaning in one of the many senses of that slippery word, meaning something like socially transmitted habits and values and beliefs. So it assumes that we won't be able to eradicate such cultural differences consistently with respecting the rights of the members of the groups, and so that we must learn to live with them. This assumption leads people to focus on trying to eliminate, or at any rate reduce, the tensions between people deriving from their identities in this sense by expanding the flow of information between groups and so increasing intergroup understanding. And guided by this idea, communities engage in multicultural education, which involves teaching children about the cultures, in this first sense, of people of all the identities in their society. And public and private institutions also conduct other multicultural projects in museums, in galleries, and in the media that aim to educate members of each group about the others. But we use the word culture in a second sense to refer to literature, music, and the arts. And in multiculturalist thinking, arts get associated with the cultures of those who produce them. Thus, multiculturalism also generates programs in which the arts of various groups are celebrated because people think this produces a particularly valuable form of understanding and generates a form of cross-cultural respect, both of which are supposed to make cross-cultural hostility less likely. While multiculturalists invite us to celebrate diversity, these responses seem to presuppose that without active interventions by state and civil society, diversity of identity will actually lead to trouble. Multiculturalism celebrates diversity, that is, while acting as if it might be dangerous. Perhaps the anxiety is warranted. There is, after all, a long history of communal conflict between ethno-religious groups, and in both the Christian and the Muslim worlds in particular, sectarian conflict has a long and bloody history. You might suppose this wasn't terribly surprising. After all, take any two groups of people in a single society with different traditions. These cultural differences may well lead them to have different views on questions of public life, and so they find themselves disagreeing about these questions and noticing that their disagreements are associated with their differences in identity. This is a perfectly common sense idea, but when you examine actual disputes, it often looks as though the real direction of causality goes in the opposite direction. In other words, conflict between groups is often expressed as conflict over habits or values or beliefs, though the intensity of the conflict is often out of all proportion to the intensity of the disagreements. We should recall in the Christian context that people have killed each other over the distinction between transubstantiation and consubstantiation, which I challenge you to explain. The explanation for this is not far to seek. We are creatures that evolved with a strong tendency to differentiate between in-groups and out-groups, and then to value advancing not just ourselves, but our groups over others. The markers of difference, including the cultural markers, help us keep track of the groups, whether or not they matter very much in themselves. And habits and values are as likely to be different because we are concerned to keep our distinctive identities as because we're independently convinced of their desirability. If everyone had already been wearing a mohawk, mohawks wouldn't have been a great way of insisting on a punk rocker identity. So differences in culture can produce disagreements and conflict, but identity difference can sustain differences in culture that then serve as an alibi for hostility. Multicultural communities can generate trouble in a different and subtler way that has been pointed out by Robert Putnam. I'll give you the reference. Civic life works best when there is civic trust. In diverse communities, it turns out there's less trust. It's not just that Catholics in multi-religious neighborhoods are less likely to trust Protestants or Muslims or Jews. It turns out that they're less likely to trust each other. Well, faced with problems like these, we should obviously do something. Increasing respect and understanding across groups is one obvious response, but there are others. For example, because differences in values and beliefs and culture in the first sense tend to make people want different things from the state, and because equality is an important democratic value, multiculturalists often favor adjustments in the state's behavior, for example, in public education, as well as in the behavior of non-state institutions, for example, in terms of employment. That way, we make explicit that people of minority identities are indeed both equal citizens and valued members of society. Perhaps this will even help to create greater civic trust. These adjustments for difference are often associated with a second response, the one that Charles Taylor dubbed a politics of recognition, in which the state responds to various identity groups in ways that are meant to demonstrate respect for them and for their members. One form of this is to treat their culture, in the sense of their arts, respectfully, which again underwrites programs in literature and music and the arts and so on. But other forms involve symbolic action, such as the creation of public holidays, celebrating the achievements of a group, or acknowledging their religious festivals in the media, or having public officials attend their celebrations, a practice that in the West goes back at least to William of Orange's decision to go to the opening of a great synagogue in Amsterdam. There are distinct responses here, and they have distinct rationales, as I've suggested. Increasing understanding of the values and beliefs is motivated by the thought that you can thus reduce hostility. Adjusting the state's behavior in the name of equality should respond to the different values and beliefs of members of the various groups, and adopting a politics of recognition should express symbolically the equality of all in society, whatever their ethno-racial or religious identity. Now, there's much to agree with in this multicultural picture, I think, but there are also things I think we should question. And it's easiest to see why, against the background of a sketch of the sort of liberal cosmopolitanism that I suspect that most people in this room mostly share. So I'm not going to have to defend it, I just wish to remind you of its contents. Now, liberalism, of course, is a tradition with many roots. One is the mellow humanism of Montaigne, who rejected both cruelty and dogmatism, gently mocking both. After all, he wrote, it's putting one's conjectures at a rather high price to roast a man alive for them. A second route is the conviction that people are best left in charge of their own lives. This is the liberalism of Wilhelm von Humboldt and his disciple John Stuart Mill. If a person desires any tolerable amount, possesses any tolerable amount of common sense and experience, Mill wrote in On Liberty, his own mode of laying out his existence is the best. Of course, Mill also insisted that there were limits on our development of our individuality set by the harms we pose for others, and the hard work is drawing these boundaries in the right place. Liberalism is rooted, too, in John Locke's conviction that we have rights before we have rulers, so that government is constrained by the individual rights of the governed. And in the 20th century, in many places, liberals adopted from a socialist tradition the recognition that the rights that matter are social as well as civil, to work, to a decent standard of living, to access to healthcare, the sort of things that are in Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was a natural extension of a concern for equality that increasingly pervades the liberal tradition. It was also a reaction against forms of liberalism that focused so much on individuality that they forgot that human beings are social creatures with social needs. These philosophical theories developed in partnership with liberal practices, religious toleration in Holland in the 17th century, the constitutional protection of individual rights in the French and American revolutions, the protection of private property, the gradual extension of the vote in the liberal democracies, and the development of welfare guarantees. What makes all these ideas and practices liberal, I think, is that they aim at a world in which every person has a life that is liberalis, that is, worthy of a free human being. Liberals imagine a world in which no one is treated like a slave. Because liberalism grows out of a rejection of slavery and subordination, much of it is about saying no to the things that damaged the lives of slaves. No to cruelty, no to domination, no to disrespect and assaults on self-respect. Now, if you think of yourself as one of the heirs of the European Enlightenment, and I do, you can be proud that liberal theory and practice began in the West, but it turns out that liberalism travels well, though it needs constant defense, even in its birthplace. One of the strengths of the liberal tradition is that it can settle in slightly different forms in many soils. That is one consequence of having many roots. Women around the world, it turns out, would like to be free from the domination of husbands, fathers, and brothers, even when they love them. People in Ghana, where I grew up, prefer democracy to military dictatorship. We know because we've experienced both. We have seen in recent months that ordinary Arabs believe they have a right to a real say in governing their own societies. They are fed up with not living lives worthy of free people. But the hostility to dogmatism that Montaigne so perfectly embodied, his deep recognition of the fallibility of all human understandings, including his own, makes liberals happiest if people come to their own conclusions. If each person is responsible for her own life, then maybe her own way of laying out her life really is best, even if she lays out a life different from the one that I or you would have chosen for ourselves or for her. We welcome the voices in the Arab world calling for freedom, but we welcome too the fact that they will find in freedom lives that are different from our own. That thought is at the heart of cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is not just, as its etymology suggests, the idea that we are all citizens of one human community, cosmopolites, citizen of the world or the universe. It's that, but it's more. It adds to the claim that each one of us is an equal member of a moral community, the conviction that our fellow world citizens are all entitled, as we are, to shape lives and societies responsive to their own conceptions of what is worth having and doing and being. The liberal cosmopolitan is ready to accept that there are many different worthwhile ways of human life, only one of which is her own. Of course, if you extend to others the right to shape a society and a life of your own, it would be strange to deny that right to yourself. As a result, the cosmopolitan claims the right to put down roots in a particular place and to value the peculiar ways of a particular place for herself. So we can be rooted cosmopolitans. The most important historical slander against cosmopolitanism is that it's rootless. We can be rooted cosmopolitans, the liberal says, embedded in one of the many places that commands respect because it is a human place, a community of free people working out a fate together. And that means that in the name of that right, we can ask people who join us to accept some of the special terms that define our particular society. These terms must be consistent with liberal principle. We're inviting people to join a community of freedom, not asking them to bind themselves to an unbending tradition they cannot explore and question, as we do. And our traditions are not univocal. My country, the United States, has both Catholic and Protestant, both Christian and Jewish, both religious and atheist traditions. Muslims in the United States have joined an ongoing practice of cohabitation among these many views. They cannot ask for it to be upended, and by and large, they have not asked for that. But we can't expect them to find a place unless we're willing to try to explain what it is that they're being asked to join. Introduction to the civic institutions of our society and clarity about our political institutions are part of what we owe migrants, immigrants. So a rooted cosmopolitan inhabits one of many possible human ways of life. But she doesn't think that her way is the best for everybody. First of all, she knows with Montaigne that it could be improved. But second, what's best for me or for us may not be best for you or for yours. This is not a feeble relativism. All of us, we fellow citizens of the world, have standards we must keep. The conviction that people are entitled to their own lives within the limits set by the fundamental rights of all other human beings is just that, a conviction. We live by it. It's a commitment, not a way of avoiding commitments. I say this because I've discovered over the years that people are confused by Montaigne's insistence on our common human fallibility, what a philosopher would call his fallibilism. They think that a fallibilist, aware that he might be wrong, must fall into skepticism, avoiding all commitments. That's a mistake. To accept that I could always turn out to be wrong is not to be sure that I'm wrong already. It's exactly to deny that we can be sure of, unrevisably committed to, anything. Fallibilism is a matter of how you hold your convictions, not a matter of resisting convictions. Liberals believe that cruelty is terrible, that people are morally equal, that government should respect the rights of every human being. If someone thinks these claims are wrong or need revising, we're ready to listen, because we also believe that no one can be absolutely sure of anything. We're willing to re-examine even our core commitments, to re-articulate them. But that doesn't mean we're ready to give them up without an argument. We're committed to conversations about these matters, in part because we believe that there are right answers, and we're sure we have not yet found them all, though, let us admit, also because we just enjoy conversation. A final point about liberal cosmopolitanism is that it is cosmopolitan as well as liberal. Our global fellow citizenship expresses itself in a commitment to engagement with all those strangers with all their differences. But though I enter into conversation with strangers as a liberal, I'm cosmopolitan enough not to insist that the stranger starts exactly where I do. I'll defend my liberalism in the conversation if the issue comes up, but I won't stop talking to people just because they're not liberal. And I want to talk about other things than liberalism. Against the background of these ideals, some of which will be congenial to many multiculturalists, let me now insist on some of my disagreements. I have 6 points to make. They are objections to tendencies in multiculturalist thought, not to the thought of everyone who has ever claimed to be a multiculturalist. Perhaps you can be a multiculturalist by acknowledging all of these 6 things, in which case I suppose I could be a multiculturalist too. 1. Most identity groups are not defined by a shared culture, a set of habits, beliefs, and values held in common. Sunni and Shia are both Muslims. They share an identity, but a large part of what binds them together is a history of disagreements, both about ritual practice and about the early history of Islam. In fact, in general, social groups, including nations and religious sects, are much less organically integrated than people tend to assume. A shared identity is not the same thing as a common culture, especially not if culture is conceived, as it was in a philosophical tradition that goes from Herder and Fichte to Hegel, as a whole made up of integrated parts. 2, multiculturalism often underrates the significance of the fact that people belong to more than one religious or ethno-racial group. Pakistani, Pashtun, Muslim, Sunni, Deobandi, for example. These are all things that might be applied to the same person. This means that people's place in society is rarely captured by one of their identities. Most people, nobody, is ever simply Muslim or simply Norwegian. 3, the identities that matter to people include many that are not religious or ethno-racial. Gender, sexual orientation, political affiliation, occupation, vocation, all these matter as well. This means that multiculturalism often behaves as if there is such a thing as one Muslim or one Norwegian attitude on many questions where there is, in fact, a great deal of diversity of views within the groups, a diversity that's often organized, though only in part, by other identities. 4th, I agree that we're all enriched by an education and public culture that exposes us to a wide range of the literature and the arts of our own societies and of others. That is, as I said, the cosmopolitan ideal. And I think that celebrating the genuine achievements in these areas of people from a certain group as an achievement of the members of that group is indeed often a way of expressing respect for the group. But we should also recall that worthwhile art is also the achievement of some individual or individuals, and that much of the most interesting art of all kinds lives across the boundaries of identities. Some quick examples. This is Goethe. This is the tomb of Hafiz, who was the major influence on the Westostliche Divan, which is one of Goethe's most important song cycles. It's poetry cycles. It's still a place of pilgrimage in Persia today. This is somebody who many of you will recognize. These are 2 of the greatest influences on him. So, not somebody who can be identified with one ethno-religious identity in terms of his aesthetic achievement. Another example, my friend Wole Soyinka, who has the Nobel Prize in Literature, is one of the great modern interpreters both of this guy, Euripides, and of this guy, Bertolt Brecht, neither of whom are Yoruba. Final example, this man, Basho, the great haiku master of the 17th century, was a Buddhist, which means that this person, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, is part of his heritage. This sculpture is from Gandhara in today's Afghanistan, but its style is influenced by Hellenistic models that came with Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. So this slide, just two images, connects a prince in 5th century BCE Eastern India with a poet in 17th century Japan by way of a 1st or 2nd century sculpture from Afghanistan in a Greek style. My point is that wherever you start in studying the arts anywhere, you will soon be led across ethno-religious boundaries. So the arts are made by individuals, and sometimes groups of individuals. Their cultural traditions are no doubt relevant to appreciating them sometimes, but art is not usually made wholly within spheres of influence that are ethno-religious. 5, for most ethno-religious and racial groups, learning about their culture in the second artistic sense does not help very much in avoiding cross-cultural misunderstandings. Indeed, I think that misunderstandings are not really very central to the forms of ethnic, racial, and religious conflict that occur in the advanced democracies. As a result, increasing understanding is not usually going to be helpful in avoiding them. What I mean is that anti-black racism, for example, is not a matter of not understanding black people or not understanding black culture. It is a matter of having hatred or contempt for them. And though such hatred or contempt may be masked by false assertions about their culture, it's usually not caused by these false beliefs. Indeed, the false beliefs are often caused by the hatred, not the other way around. I'm just asserting things here. If you disagree, you can say so. 6, finally, true beliefs about others, the belief that they value halal or kosher meat, which requires the exsanguination of living animals, the belief that they value clitoral excision, or that we practice gay marriage, are just as able as false beliefs to lead to hostility towards people. I think that lesbian and gay people ought to be allowed to express their sexualities in erotic relationships. I think the clitorises of girls should not be excised. I think that if we are to eat animals, we should at least not treat them cruelly while they are alive. To think this is to think that it is true. It is to believe that those who do not think this are wrong. I can imagine someone being led by this fact to dislike people who disagree with them about these things. But these 6 criticisms of some regular multiculturalist analytical mistakes don't provide sufficient reason to oppose many of the multiculturalist strategies I mentioned earlier. None of these six objections suggests that you should oppose increasing understanding of the values and beliefs and celebrating the literature and art of other ethno-religious groups, or object to adjusting, have to move the pages on both of these things, and sometimes I pick the wrong one. The state's behavior where appropriate to respond, adjusting the state's behavior where appropriate to respond to the different values and beliefs of members of various groups, or reject symbolic expressions of the equality of all in society, whatever their ethno-racial or religious identity. Indeed, as a cosmopolitan, I favor the first of these, and as a liberal committed to civic equality, I favor the last two. Still, there is one line of thought often associated with multiculturalism with which, as you will anticipate, I have no sympathy. It is the idea that the fact that a particular group treats something as valuable means that it really is of value. This is a form of relativism about value that strikes me as philosophically mistaken. My liberalism helps to define a class of values that are universal. That is, they're things that are valuable whether you value them or not. Of course, sometimes something is valuable for someone because they care about it and wouldn't be valuable for them if they didn't, I grant that. And one reason people care about things is that these things, the concerns, the care for them comes from people in their families and the religious traditions of the groups to which they belong. But many things are valuable, unmutilated sexual organs, for example, whether or not the culture of your group values them. And not everything can be made valuable by caring about it, reality television, for example. It's important, therefore, not to confuse this form of cultural relativism, in which things gain value from being valued by ethno-religious communities, with some other ideas that you could also call relativist, which strike me, by contrast, as both correct and helpful in facing our circumstances of multicultural diversity. So as I just said, some things are important for people just because they've committed to them. My marriage makes my relationship with my husband important for me, which it wouldn't be if we hadn't long ago committed to one another. And my vocation as a philosopher is important because I've taken it up. If I hadn't, it wouldn't matter whether I was any good at philosophy. These are project-dependent values, things that are important because people have taken up certain projects. Still, not anything can intelligibly count as a project. So even here, there are limits on what we can endow with value. And the fact that projects can make it true that something is valuable for somebody is not itself true simply because I or anyone else believe it. It's a fine example of a non-relative truth. People can also take up projects that are in various ways mistaken. Religious projects often have metaphysical presuppositions that are wrong. This, by the way, is not a controversial claim. A majority of the world's population agrees that most religious views are mistaken because no religious tradition has captured a global majority. Even when a project is in this way mistaken, it can matter that people succeed in it, however. I don't believe that anyone has a religious duty to go to Mecca because I don't think, not being a Muslim, that Islam's distinctive claims are correct. But I do think that making the Hajj is nevertheless valuable, all things considered, for many Muslims. And I think in any case, with John Stuart Mill, that whether it is worth doing is for them to decide, though I feel perfectly entitled to explain to them when I think they're wrong, and I'm absolutely willing to hear their criticisms of my ideas. If you ask me what this means in practice, for you and for me, I should say we should each do our fair share to make sure that everybody in the world has the basic materials of a decent life, a life as a free person, a life that is liberalis. This means a government that respects and secures their rights, enough to eat, somewhere to live, the opportunity for friendship and family and for education and cultural life, security in the forms of property that allow you to make plans and pursue meaningful projects. It's a hard question to say what the fair share is that each of us owes, but I don't think that we're required to derail our own lives because others are not doing their fair share. But because cosmopolitanism of my kind has a place for difference, and because it believes that communities are entitled to seek together to shape different kinds of lives, it is not committed, as the metaphor of global citizenship has suggested to some, to world government. There are reasons to live in political communities smaller than the global, precisely because it makes it more likely that we will be able to lead decent lives. One reason for this is that the closer the exercise of political power is to a local community, the more control individuals and their families can have over how it is exercised. This suggests we should endorse principles of subsidiarity that require governments to allow people, where possible, to settle matters locally, appealing up the chain of authorities only when they need to. This means that the ideal world is a world of decent societies and associations, not a single decent society. And once you grant this, given the way people are, the problems that multiculturalism aims to face are bound to arise. For not only will people in one country find that they want to live in a variety of ways, some people will want to move between countries or will have to move to escape oppression. Differences will arise internally, as Protestantism arose in what came to be called a Roman Catholic world, and they will come with migration, as Islam has re-entered Europe. And if you think, with cosmopolitans, that these differences, provided they are disciplined by morality, are one of the wonders of our species, you will be glad about this.
Does this work? Does this microphone work? People here? Well, I want to thank both of our speakers, and it's now about 11:05, and we have till 11:30, and I want to say that at 11:30, coffee will be served both upstairs and downstairs.
And in my lady's chamber.
And we do have some time for some questions, and I'm, being the chairman, I think I can ask a question. And the question derives from what Unni was, I think, implying, and what you, Anthony, may be implying, and it has to do with your final remarks about immigrants. Because you both seem to imply that there are certain fundamental limits that should be observed on the part of immigrants vis-à-vis the values that they intend to carry out in the new country that may or may not conflict with the protections given to people in those countries as they now exist. So you seem to be implying, both of you, and I think Unni more specifically, a certain kind of social contract between the host country and the immigrant. But is that what you mean? Do you mean there should be some kind of understanding, whether explicit or should it be quite explicit, about undertakings on the part of immigrants in the sense of social behavior, tolerance, and coexistence? Now there's a question that is a more, shall we say, practical question, because the governments are facing these waves of immigrants who may or may not be agreeable to the kinds of tolerances that you have outlined so eloquently. So I'm going to ask Unni what she thinks about this.
Thank you. Yes, I do think there should be a social contract. I think it's necessary there has to be some common ground, and there has to be a kind of explicit social contract that, yes, sets out the rights and obligations that we have to one another in a plural society. I think, for instance, that as part of such a social contract, government like the Norwegian, since we are now in Norway, should have the obligation to give proper language courses, learning to each and every immigrant who wants it. I would go further. I would say it should be obligatory to learn Norwegian if you are going to be living permanently in this country. Yeah, I don't think I need to see more, but I absolutely think there should be a social contract.
Well, that is a rather difficult thing to, but I understand it as a thing. Now, I wonder what Anthony thinks.
Well, so I think it's, I mean, yes, there has to be a social understanding when people, and I would say that if it's a contract, it's important to stress what is sometimes not stressed in these contexts, which is that it's a contract, which means that both parties have commitments. Right. So the receiving society has to understand what it's asking and to think about that too. And one of the difficulties with a lot of the programs for sort of immigrant education is that they require immigrants to know things that most natives don't know. In order to become an American citizen, at one point I had to answer a very simple set of questions in an exam, but it's the last exam I ever took in my life. And
you passed.
And I passed. And my lawyer said that I should give the simplest possible answers to all the questions. So, when I was asked what the causes were of the American Civil War, I didn't say, well, that's a rather controversial question. I said, it says in your document that it was slavery. Anyway, so, but the point is, half of American high school graduates don't know what century the American Civil War occurred in, and so insisting that every Kurdish grandmother who arrives in the United States knows this, it's not clear to me what the point of that is. But nevertheless, I mean, you are inviting people in, and I think it's. I would stress the function of, as it were, invitation, the function of saying to people, look, people migrate for different kinds of reasons, of course. We are obliged to take asylees, for obvious reasons of justice, people who are going to be killed if we send them back home or tortured. We can't send them back home, and so we have to let them in, and some of them may say, well, I'm not really here, I'm just waiting to go back, and I'm not really here because I'm deeply committed to your society, and you tell me, you announce this contract with me, and I say, are not very interested in that. And I think what you have to say to such people is, well, it's true that we have an obligation to take you, but we also have, it's reasonable for us to require you to conform while you're here to certain basic norms. So that's one point. Second point, there are two kinds of things that I think it's important to communicate to migrants. One is that we're committed to certain universal standards. And we're not asking them to not to do certain things like literal excision because it's a local custom of ours not to do it. We're asking them not to do it because we think it's wrong. And we don't think if it's done where they came from, we think it's wrong that it's done there too. So there are things. And then there are things that I said, we have the right to live in particular communities. I believe in the rootedness of cosmopolitanism, and that means that we have to, some of the things we explain to people, we say, we don't think everybody ought to do this, but it's what we do around here. If we're Dutch, we consult each other about changes to the exterior of our buildings. We know in America you don't do that. In America, you can insult your neighbors by putting ridiculous things on your front door. That's a property right you have. But in Holland, we are more careful about these things, or whatever. Or where we are, because we have Christian traditions, we don't count it as an abuse of the peace to ring bells, loud bells, in villages on Sundays. But we might count it as a breach of the peace if you had a rock concert that had exactly the same number of decibels. This is just a local view of ours about what counts as a disturbance. So I think we've got to accept that if people have the right to sort of shape communities in different ways, which is the rooted cosmopolitan thought, then one of the things you have to explain to people is that you live in a particular way. Once they become citizens and part of the community, they're part of the democratic process of deciding whether that's going to continue to be your way. But when they arrive, you have to sort of show them what it is. And I think, you invite them in. You say, actually, this habit of ours of coffee and cooked cake is a nice habit, and we Norwegians make good cakes. We make good coffee, and so on. So I tend to favour, thinking of it in a more as a matter of sort of invitation than constraint. But the aim is, however you achieve it, the aim, yes, should be to make sure that we continue with shared both understandings at the universal level and at the particular level of a particular national or local set of institutions.